Today's parsha, double parsha, brings to conclusion the Torah's narrative story arc. The 40-year wilderness period has ended, and the Israelites are engaged in final business, internally and externally, before settling the land itself. In Deuteronomy, Moshe will prepare them further with a series of lectures, but today concludes the story. The double parsha is dense with material, almost all of it unnerving. We begin with laws of the vows one makes to God, with the limitation that a woman who lives in her husband's or father's house can have her vow unilaterally annulled by that man. God commands Moshe in his final act of leadership to lead a war of vengeance against the Midianites who had sought Israel's destruction through the sorcerer Balaam, as well as concerted and successful effort by Midianite women to lure Israelite men into desertion. Moses harangues his people for taking the Midianite women captive instead of outright slaughtering those who were adult. The daughters of Zelophehad make a reappearance. Their successful plea for an inheritance rights that we were all celebrating is now rolled back a bit by a counter plea that results in the limitation that they must marry within their tribe. God issues a description of the future borders of the promised land that only a rabid West Bank settler could love. The tribes of Reuben and Gad petition to settle outside of the land of Israel because the land is better for raising cattle, thus rejecting their inheritance, rejecting God's intentions, and at least partially repeating the offense of the spies. A compromise is made whereby they will provide shock troops for the upcoming war. I can only imagine that the divine intention behind this odd finale to the Torah story is that this material has been saved for the end, because God knows, as I mentioned, that we need all the experience of reading Torah deeply for the past 10 months to sufficiently tackle it without merely recoiling and jumping to conclusions. Every single part requires a deeper read. None of it that makes it all go away, but all of it demands a deeper read. I tell my daughters, and I teach, that Torah is kind of like a mirror. As the proverb says, one heart reflects back another, like one face is reflected back in water. And Torah is like a watery mirror to me, where first we must look deeply, we're both looking deeply at ourselves when we're looking into its words, and we're also looking into the heart of God. So let's do a little bit of deeper reading. We have what I mentioned earlier, which is men get to control women outright. Is it so simple? Listen, I admit, I don't know what this meant in the biblical period, and maybe it meant a lot the way it sounds. But what I do know is how the rabbis understand it in the Talmud and halachically, which, as I said, it was to prevent men from controlling women through silence and not supporting them. In addition, the rabbis make it clear in halacha that, well, why daughters and not sons? Well, the reason is that all minors, halachically, can have their vows rejected by their parents while they're still minors, boys and girls. And adults cannot have, except for the spouse, cannot have their vows rejected before God once you're an adult. So halachically, the only reason, as Rashi points out, it comes up, is that girls have a 6-month period during their 12th year when they are in between being a minor and they're being an adult, which is the reason girls get bat mitzvahed. They can be bat mitzvahed in Israel earlier than 13, but they shouldn't be really when they turn 12. It's a shorter period. So that the whole thing only applies to girls between 12 and 12 and a half. In addition, is it only men? No, and the halakha is clear. The person who runs the house can reject. If it is a woman-led household, then the woman is the man in this case. So the head of the household, woman or man, can be the one to... So it's not as simple as it sounds, but it's also not as simple with my apologetics. It's still complicated. In other words, maybe it's not so patriarchal, maybe it's paternalistic. Is that great? But wait, women can be paternalistic too. And I can tell you from dealing with teenagers who have all kinds of ideas of what vows they're making about what they wear and what they eat and what they're going to do and who their friends are going to be, I can tell you that I like to be a little paternalistic about making some influence about what is allowed and what is not allowed. But at the very least, it's complicated. How about Moses' war of vengeance? That requires a deeper read. Again, we're not going to simplify it. It's not about making the problem go away. We don't look into Torah and the problems that we struggle with in ourselves suddenly disappear. We may gain some enlightenment to them, but the struggle continues, hopefully with more wisdom, more reflection, and maybe with a different sense of purpose through clarity and moral clarity. Moses' war of vengeance. Though commanded to engage in war, as we all saw in the parashah, there's no indication that God has ordered these extreme measures, particularly against Midianite women, that Moses demands. It's obviously glaring and becomes a major rabbinic conversation. What is on Moses' mind? If these vengeful things against Midianite women are his own initiative, the happiest days of his life were living in Midian as a young man, marrying a Midianite woman, Zipporah, living in Caine, Midian, Yitro's home with all of the Midianite sisters. And now he is behind a demand to slaughter Midianite women? Many of the rabbinic commentators see this, and these are the ones I see most often quoted, as actually excruciating for Moses for these reasons. They see clues that he finds the whole situation, they see textual clues that he finds the whole situation unbearable every step of the way. We must be vengeful against the Midianite women. Even though I'm married to a Midianite woman, even though I grew up in Midian, I loved Midian, especially the women. And so what I have to do, what I feel I'm having to do, or to prove myself, is he goes beyond the situation. On the other hand, I personally could imagine the other side of this debate. With his primary emotional and psychological sense of home being the memory of home among the Midianites. And I interject here, which is I know we all come from a home in our childhood, but psychology and my personal experience tells us that our deepest values are often formed in late adolescence and early 20s. Often that home is such a touchstone, not just the house in which we grew up with. Those formative years of Moshe as a young man. So I can imagine his primary emotional and psychological sense of home being his memory of home among the Midianites. Moshe feels extra betrayed by their attacks on the Israelites when Israel is no threat to Midian. The betrayal is profound. I'm just saying the other side of the debate I see when I reflect in the mirror. Considering that the heart of ancient Midian was in present-day Saudi Arabia, this is a case of history repeating itself. We often forget that the initial Israelite exile by the Babylonians in the 6th century BCE produced large Jewish communities in Arabia. These were some of the most ancient Jewish communities in the world. They were peaceful, they were mutually beneficial builders of that region. They were indigenous by any sense of the word, as the Midianites actually were also nomadic, like the Israelites. They had settlements. It wasn't like the country had a line around it and a central government. So we were as indigenous as the Midianites because we settled 5 primary areas, and we lived in harmony for over 1,000 years until they were persecuted, exiled, and murdered with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. Perhaps Moses felt it was unbearable to make war on Midian because it was his home, or perhaps he felt especially called to do so through a sense of personal betrayal over their needless attacks on Israelite existence. How about the situation with Reuben and God? A deeper look. Is it just as I don't know if we teach in Hebrew school because I teach that part and I don't teach it this way, but let's say, is it just the Hebrew school lesson, that Reuben and God, they were selfish and materialistic, and so they were outside of the land, and in a way they live in this kind of exile. Resonances with modern day war continue with the situation of Reuben and God. Does it mean to fully identify as a Jew, but live outside the land of Israel, especially in a time of Israel's vulnerability? What is the status of a Jew who lives outside the land of Israel? Since it would be wrong to call them Galut Jews. I hear all you're Galut Jew, you're Galut Jew. Can't call them a Galut Jew because they're really part of the confederation. It's wrong to call them Galut Jews. Can you live outside the land but not be a Galut Jew today? But then, what's the deal? They got to support the war. Does that mean that as a Jew who identifies with Israel living outside its lands, I can imagine a lot of people reading today and, oh, I see it clearly. My instant reaction, if you don't have your kids in the army, if you don't serve in the army, shut up. So does that mean, unless you support its wars and have your children serve in its defense, as one might well read from these verses, in today's debate over whether that means supporting its defense through advocating for U.S. military aid, how can these verses not raise the debate of our tradition as oddly fresh, if we're really going to look in the water at Torah this week? On the other hand, the other side of that debate, does it mean that those Jews who live outside the land and who do not participate in its defense need to shut up about these wars, especially if they oppose them or oppose military aid? Interestingly, the rabbis note that the text seems to contradict itself in a very strange way. On the one hand, the text clearly says that Reuben and Gad give up their inheritance, though not their identity, suggesting they should not have a say. On the other hand, it contradicts itself by indicating that their inheritance of the land is actually preserved nonetheless. So at first, the text is just a contradiction within the text itself. At first, the text says that if you don't send your shock troops, you're a sinner and you're a violation. But then in chapter 32, verse 30, Moses reports to the future leaders, Yehoshua and Elazar, V'im lo ya'avru chalutzim itchem, v'nochazu b'tochachem be'eretz Canaan. Here's reports, if they don't go as pioneers with you into the war, they will still inherit among you in the land of Canaan. It's almost like it's missing the negative. If they refuse to go to the war, then the offending tribes actually get to keep their inheritance in the land of Canaan. If they don't fight, they still get what everyone else receives, their ancestral inheritance, Canaan. For those of us who feel like Reuben and Gad, strongly connected to the land but not living in it, this debate, this contradiction is lived within our souls and in our communities. Are we entitled to our stake in the land if we do not participate in its defense, or we have very different from mainstream, let's say, views? Or are we not entitled to our inheritance? I'm going to finish today with something I should be doing every week, I know, and I forget. Many imperfections. After the pandemic, my daughter Ziva said, every week you should give a kid version of what you just said. And I always forget. So I'm going to give the kid version for at least Ziva before her bat mitzvah, when she was still a minor. I'd still like to veto some of their choices. I really feel for the text invites us to look beyond the surface, Ziva. And I feel a lot like Moses. I feel like on the one hand, I feel like my home in America has betrayed me with its rampant anti-Semitism. And I have anger. And not only do I have anger, I feel I have moral justification. So am I the Moses of anger who says, yeah, we're going to take vengeance on the home that should know better? Or there's a part of the Moses in me that is just excruciatingly in pain over the whole thing. Because this is my home, and so many of its values I identify with. And so is it actually, it's not my anger, I'm just in a lot of excruciating pain over the rising anti-Semitism in my home that I feel is morally suspect. And I identify with Reuben and Gad. They settled outside the land, but they fully identify as Jews. And there are those, Eva, in our community who say, you know, I don't care. There's some people who are going to say to us, you have no right to have an opinion. But on the other hand, make sure you vote for aid to Israel. You have no right to have an opinion because we didn't serve. There's part of me that agrees. I mean, the Torah is saying, like, there is so much American Jewish discussion that makes no sense within the land of Israel. They're having different discussions. So there's a part of me that says, we should have the humility to know that we don't know what it's like to live in the land and serve. I'm talking about my family. But on the other hand, I also feel like my identity stands, and people say any of us shouldn't have a voice, should be quiet, because no matter what, even when we rebel, we have an inheritance in Israel that cannot be questioned. Shabbat Shalom.